written in blood. It is the most coveted of all ancient artifacts. In it is written the history and the fate of every human being. And he who owns it writes his own destiny. Now, Indiana Jones follows a trail of danger, magic, and archaeological mystery through the war-torn Orient, from Rangoon to the Egyptian desert, searching for the secret underground hiding place of the all-powerful Omega Book. But with a beautiful woman seeking her missing magician husband, and a vengeance-crazed Japanese spy master hot on his heels, Indy is running out of time. If the Omega Book falls into the wrong hands, not only his own fate, but the fate of the world will be at the mercy of a madman bent on writing humanity's final chapter. Death is in his future when Indy sets out to unlock the mystery of the ages. Indiana Jones and the Secret of the Sphinx.
Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This video is a review of the 12th and final book in the Indiana Jones Bantam series of novels, Indiana Jones and the Secret of the Sphinx, which was the fourth and last book to be written by Max McCoy, who was the third and final author of the Indy novels after Rob McGregor and Martin Caidin. This very much follows the path set by his previous three books and does manage to tie up a few loose little ends and form a nice sort of send-off for the Bantam Indy novels. And in fact, it's so good in terms of the flavor of adventure as the other McCoy books I've reviewed. It's a shame that the series didn't continue. This was where Bantam lost the rights, and the rights changed hands, reverted back to Lucas Books, I believe, and then eventually wound up at Del Rey. And they didn't really do anything with Indy, which is unfortunate, and honestly a sign of how Indy has been handled in all areas of merchandising. So after this final Bantam novel in 1999, we would have to wait until 10 years later in 2009 to see another Indy novel, which was written by Steve Perry, Army of the Dead, as a standalone following the release of Crystal Skull. So this is the last book in the Bantam series, so it's the final in my series of video reviews, and it's interesting being now at the end of the Bantam books because, as I've said in my reviews of the other McCoy books, the McCoy novels are definitely the closest in tone and spirit in terms of the closest the Bantam novels come to the spirit of the films. And if anyone was just looking for an indie book experience that was like the films, I would obviously point them to the Max McCoy novels as their jumping off point. And the four novels overall, when you compare them, have a sort of chronology to them and some elements that continue over and are mostly wrapped up in his third book, Hollow Earth, which is just preceding this one. But there are a few extra little bits that are here in Secret of the Sphinx, so it is good to read them in chronological order. But you can also see the writer becoming more comfortable with the indie tone and also developing the actual MacGuffin of the story and the actual journey and adventure and plotting. I think some are a little bit more effective than others. And interestingly, what happens here in Secret of the Sphinx is sort of the opposite of how I felt about Hollow Earth, which is, like most of the Bantam novels, quite a decent-sized book. All the Bantam books are, pushing, well over 200 pages, usually about 300 pages. So it's quite lengthy. But Hollow Earth has so many great ideas and subplots and things that it kind of feels a little disjointed and almost episodic, and we really only get to the quest of this particular indie story towards the end of the book, which is an issue that I've had in a lot of the previous Bantam books. Some basically save the quest for the last act or the last 50, sometimes even less pages. So unfortunately, the ending can feel rushed. Hollow Earth has a degree of that. So I wish that it had been a bit more consistently plotted and gotten to that quest a bit sooner. Well, here in Secret of the Sphinx, it's very much a book that is a straightforward adventure and has a significantly reduced page count. This is the only indie book that's under 200 pages, which is why it's a slimmer volume when you pick it up and you're kind of like, wait, this doesn't look the same. But honestly, that's not necessarily a bad thing in this case, because it's almost as if somebody heard some of my criticisms about Hollow Earth in spite of still really enjoying that book, because Secret of the Sphinx is a straightforward adventure. We have the sort of opening action beat, and that basically puts Indy on this pathway. So it's got the feeling of Temple of Doom, where there's an opening event that puts Indy on a path, and he meets a variety of characters who go along for the ride and incurs the wrath of the villain, and they basically get chased all over, except instead of winding up in India, they basically start in China and wind all the way up in Egypt for the conclusion of the book. So there is an entire sense of globetrotting because they go over all of Asia and then to go down into Egypt. So there are many set pieces over a very substantially long journey. Unfortunately, this comes at the cost, at least to some degree, of some character development, some villain development, and unfortunately, the actual story itself and the MacGuffin does feel a little bit more one note because it is a very straightforward adventure story, and it's also got a much lesser page count. So I think we've turned up the narrative drive in terms of getting that plot moving immediately. This is by far the fastest paced and the most adventure driven of all the Bantam Indy novels. And of course, being well under 200 pages, you kind of have to have that as a factor. But that means we don't get as much time with the villains, who are, they're good and interesting and creative, but they're not as fleshed out. But again, none of the villains in the Bantam Indy books have ever been all that fleshed out. And in some ways, we know a bit more about them, even though the characterizations are a bit simple because we don't spend as much time with them here in Sphinx as compared to some of the earlier books where we didn't really have anything about villains at all in certain ones. So essentially, Secret of the Sphinx is, I think, of all the indie books, the one that most easily would translate to the screen. I think you can take this book and basically turn it into a screenplay exactly as it's written, and you've got a film right there. There would definitely be things that I would like to see get beefed up a little bit, and also have a little bit more development with the actual historical artifacts and how they are obtained and used. But otherwise, this is the most adventure driven and fastest plotted and easiest book in the Bantam series to just pick up and read cold without any knowledge or past experience with an Indiana Jones novel. So if you want a great indie book and you just know the films and you've never looked at any material outside of the 3 films, even though this is the last book and there are going to be some references to some of McCoy's past books, this one would probably be the easiest to pick up and read straight through, and it feels like indie. We see indie characters pop up because we have both Sala and Marcus Brody, for example. It is close to the time period of the films, so this is basically taking place just before the Temple of Doom era in 1935, and so we've come full circle with these books starting as prequels with younger indie with the Rob McGregor books, and now we've come all the way up to just before Temple of Doom starting. As far as the plot, there are a number of interesting elements, and Indy starts the adventure on essentially an archaeological expedition in China, examining a lost tomb that quickly is filled with increasing amounts of rather interesting booby traps, and Indy basically has to get through it by the skin of his teeth, and then manages to catch the attention of a group of Japanese headed by the spy master Sokai, who is this very flamboyant character who's fascinated with American culture, but is an expert Japanese spy and master of basically every form of physical combat, and also just, again, rather flamboyantly dressed, and just a very striking character. And then we have what starts to be a torture sequence with a rather ghastly device that's used on Indy for a period of time. But in the process of Indy escaping, the villain is disfigured, and Indy then takes his knowledge that he's learned and tries to get the heck out of there. And in the process runs into the rest of the group that's going to tag along for the adventure, which interestingly is a group of stage magicians who are giving a performance that just so happens to be near the sort of prison Indy escapes from. And they are Faye Maskelyne, who is an American daughter of a famous British stage magician. She's basically carrying on the family tradition, and her young daughter, wonderfully named Mystery. And so basically, because they sort of aid Indy escaping, they basically have to hightail it out of China as well, because now everybody's after them, and you have an interesting sort of dynamic which feels very much akin to what you'd see in a 1930s serial or an indie film or a classic adventure film. The reason why Faye and Mystery are even there is they are actually searching for her lost husband, who went off in search of a mystical artifact, and then basically Indy gets roped in because it's quite an alluring story, but they are essentially now on the trail of the staff of Aaron, sometimes known as the staff of Moses. This is, of course, the famous staff that was used and turned into a snake and various things, and is supposed to have mystical or magical properties to it if anyone is able to obtain it. And in the process of trying to find the staff, it is eventually revealed that there is actually a second artifact that it is tied to that is even more of great importance, and that is the Omega Book, which is supposedly the book alluded to by many different mythologies and religions that contains the information and history of everyone living on planet Earth, both past, present, and of course future as well. So being able to have that in your possession would give anyone untold power. And of course, the last thing you need is a power-mad Japanese spy master who now only has one eye, who also hates your guts. You wouldn't want him or his rather creepy old magician counterpart with a great knowledge of the dark arts, to get their hands on it. So then there's a degree of a race against time, and we have many wonderful set pieces on the journey from China all the way to Egypt, which of course include everything from shipwrecked in a hurricane, being stuck on an island of lepers, being stuck in a back alley, seedy basement in Egypt where the person's stock and trade is to dig up corpses and try to turn them into fake mummies to sell as mummy parts, and deciding he's going to do this to Indy and his companions and dump them into an embalming tank. So there's loads of fun, pulpy adventure elements in this book, and you will be entertained on every single page. This is probably, of all the indie books overall, this one is the one that you can't really put down the most, because the adventure quality is so good and so consistent that we come to really like the side characters. Plus, there's the extra degree of Indy having a sort of quasi-paternal relationship with the mystery character. And again, I love that as a name. It's such a cute idea. And rather nicely, it's very obvious that she sort of has a young girl's crush on Indy, and that causes awkwardness. And of course, her mom is there the whole time. So it's a fun dynamic that McCoy plays around with, and it makes you care about the side characters, which McCoy has done a great job with in all four of his novels. But because you care about the characters, and the set pieces are so good, and the pacing is so good and so fast, once you get hooked into the story, you just want to keep going and you want to finish. So again, this has the most unable to put down a quality, I think, of all the Bantam novels. The plot builds to the climax where they are searching for a secret tomb in and around, or perhaps even underneath, the Great Sphinx itself, and Indy gets to introduce everyone to Sala, who accompanies them. So there's an interesting sort of, hey, here's Indy and Sala having another nighttime unsanctioned dig out in the middle of the desert, but now they're under the Sphinx, and this is just before, about a year before Raiders. Unfortunately, because the book is so much shorter, there is not as much of the sort of big action climax you would expect from an adventure novel, and being the final act of the book. It's good, it's fitting, but it just feels a bit underbaked in terms of the sort of expectation you have as the reader getting to the very end of the story. All the character arcs are great and perfectly executed, and for example, where the characters end up, what happens in the finale, what happens to the villain and the henchmen who have menaced our trio throughout the book. Everything fits and feels good, and it has a nice conclusion, but you just get the feeling, in the sense that the actual climax was just a bit underdone, and I don't know if that might be something to do with what I've read and seen McCoy indicate a little bit in some interviews, and also why the book may be shorter than the others is that apparently he originally had a little bit of a time travel element in this book, and the publishers or Lucas Books basically nixed that, so that was just basically removed. So I think there might be some degree of truth in that, and that might be why the book is significantly shorter, at least in some areas. But again, I'm just kind of guessing simply because I stumbled across that in an interview, and there's a number of little interviews, and there was a couple podcasts as well, which I'll link to, that I found that were great listens that give you more of the insight of how the authors had to approach Indy and what some of the constraints were. I also thought that the actual obtaining of the staff was just a little bit coincidental. Essentially, our heroic trio winds up in a particular area, and it just so happens that the people they're staying with basically have the staff in a secret temple that no one is supposed to know about, and the actual getting of it is good and well done, and how it works out is well done, but it just seemed really coincidental, like they almost kind of stumbled across what they were looking for. And then on top of that, it's also an artifact that supposedly has mystical powers, and when certain people pick it up, it basically picks up on any sort of latent abilities they might have or they are not aware that they have. And that's a trope we've seen done so many times. That's basically a part of classical adventure storytelling. That's not a problem, but it does feel just a little bit, again, coincidental that one of our group just happens to have this ability that nobody knew about and otherwise was not really established. So, that's also an element that feels a little bit coincidental. And again, I don't know if any of this would have been helped by perhaps not having some of the edits done to the original story, or if any of these elements were any different. But I certainly would have liked to seen those two elements fleshed out a little bit more along with the climax as well. But again, without knowing exactly what the editing process entailed with the original draft or manuscript, it's hard to say what elements were different or tweaked or removed entirely for the finished version. Ultimately, though, Secret of the Sphinx is a ridiculously entertaining read. I don't know if I would necessarily put it as the best of the Bantam novels because, again, I think the page count being so much shorter and it being a direct adventure does cost it a little bit in some of the development. So if you were to compare it to McCoy's other novels, this is basically the opposite of Hollow Earth in terms of it's also a really good book, but the few issues I have with it are basically the opposite. It's significantly shorter. It's driven on the quest and the adventure from the get-go, but it's at the cost of some character and plot development and some occasional bits of extra richness and texture, which we get plenty of in Hollow Earth, but it's also too long, and the quest comes in, I think, too late. So it's basically the opposite. It's like a different rendering, the mirror image of Hollow Earth. So if you've read the books before and you liked Hollow Earth, but you wish it was a bit more streamlined, a bit more focused, you get that in Secret of the Sphinx. So it's basically the mirror opposite. So of the McCoy books, I would probably say this is probably just behind Dinosaur Eggs, which probably remains my favorite overall of the four McCoy books because it has the all the great elements of McCoy's Indy's novels, and it doesn't quite suffer as much as some of the others from these particular issues. But Secret of the Sphinx is probably just behind that because it is ridiculously good. But on just a sheer entertainment and enjoyment level, I would be very tempted to put Secret of the Sphinx as the best of the McCoy books and the best of the Bantam novels. This is the closest to the actual films in terms of spirit and pacing that you get in the Bantam novels. This is basically an indie film, just it's in book form. You can envision the film in your head as you go along. The best moments of all the Bantam books, you can do that, and I think you can do that with all the McCoy books 100%. But of all the books overall, Secret of the Sphinx is the one that comes the closest to the film's tone, energy, spirit, and of course McCoy nails the humor in the moment, and what Indy would realistically do, especially when in the thick of it and things are not going very well, and it looks like, yeah, they're probably all gonna die in like 5 seconds. So Indy has to come up with something, and he's not too pleased about the predicament. So the humor is always really rewarding in these, and I think the best of the Bantam books by far. So honestly, it's really good that the Bantam novels went out on a high note, and it's a darn shame that they couldn't continue. I know McCoy has said that he enjoyed writing Indy and would have liked to do a bit more, but didn't want to stay doing it forever and wanted to move on to other things, which is understandable. But, I definitely think he did a really wonderful job with his 4 books. I think they show a nice progression, and he became more and more comfortable with writing the character. And I think the set pieces and the action got better and the humor got more refined. And I think he had a good handle on the tone of the character. And I really wish he could have done at least another 1 or 2 books if Bantam had gotten another deal or it had worked out somehow, because it doesn't make sense that the rights changed hands and then Lucas Books didn't do anything until 10 years later. But unfortunately, that's just how it goes with indie and merchandising. And after that Steve Perry novel in 2009, there hasn't been anything in terms of adult Indiana Jones novels, which, again, makes zero sense. Now, to talk about the book itself, we once again have beautiful Drew Struzan artwork. That's another reason why these books are so collectible, and you want to find them in good shape because the Struzan art is fantastic. This has a lovely bold orange background to go with the sort of torches and the lit up Sphinx. We've got lovely likenesses of Sala and Brody on the cover as well. It's really nicely done. And of course, like all the books, has a nice sort of wraparound artwork design. So they're very much nice display pieces as well. You can also see just how much thinner this book is. So again, this is just under 200 pages, including the historical notes at the end. McCoy does a really great job of writing about his research and the actual historical basis for bits in his novels. Those sections are usually in the back of the Bantam Indy books, which is a great touch, but the McCoy ones are definitely the most approachable, I think. Now, this is a slightly later 3rd printing of the book, but I am not sure if the first printing did retain the embossed logo. I think they started to drop that on the last couple books, but again, I just to have this 3rd printing. But unfortunately, all the books are long out of print. They only partially came back into print in 2008 for the release of Crystal Skull, and it seems like they printed volumes sporadically and then they just stopped. So if you find any of the novels, it's either going to be the original prints from the 90s or 1 or 2 later printings like this one, also from the 90s, or it's going to be from 2008, and those were very short-lived. So otherwise, unfortunately, you are stuck searching used bookshops and eBay and trying not to pay through the nose, because unfortunately, most sellers do know the sort of out of print, hard to find status of the indie books. So they can be tricky to find, but it is really worth it for the best of them. And Secret of the Sphinx is definitely one of the best of the Bantam novels, and just a fantastic read. And it's nice to see the books go out on a high note. So those are my thoughts on the 12th and final of the Indiana Jones Bantam novels, Secret of the Sphinx. While this is definitely a more simplified plot, and it is a little bit weird at first because you're used to the significantly longer Bantam books, and you start this and we have the opening action and you expect it to transition to something else, but no, we're on a full adventure from the get-go. And once you get on board with that, it does take basically that whole opening sequence, because you're, after reading the 11 books up to this point, you're kind of primed for a lengthier bit of exposition and more subplots and things. So once you get through that opening sequence and you're able to go, oh, so this is like Temple of Doom, and we're just going to start here and everything goes haywire, and then it's just a never-ending, slide downward of endless set pieces, and Indy's day becoming worse and worse and worse. Once you get on board with that, and you know what the book is doing and what the type of story is, then it finally clicks in, and you can get fully on board with it. And I think this will definitely be a book that I'm going to enjoy more and more and more on various rereads over the years. So this is definitely the tightest plotted of the Indy novels in the Bantam series. I think it's the closest in terms of pacing to the films, and like the best of the Bantam novels, you can envision the film version of this book in your head as you're reading it, which I think is really the essential quality for any great Indy book. Can you actually envision Harrison Ford doing this stuff in an Indy film? And you certainly can in Secret of the Sphinx, which is the most straightforward, pure adventure Indy novel of all the Bantam books, and would be my recommendation for anybody who has never read an Indy novel. If you're just going to pick up one and go in cold, start with Secret of the Sphinx, even though it is the last book and it does reference to some events of McCoy's previous books. This one is the best straightforward adventure in its own right. So this concludes my review series of the 12 Indiana Jones Bantam novels. I really hate that these are out of print and not often discussed, because they're a fascinating part of the character's history. I've really enjoyed finally getting to read all of these in order, and I would advise people or fans interested in the Bantam books to definitely be patient and try to track down good solid copies without paying a ton of money. I know that's difficult to do, because basically you're stuck with searching eBay and having a save search, or picking up one book at a time in a bookstore, and they rarely pop up in used bookstores. I know over the years I would just find just one or two here and there, and until I sat down and tried to make a dedicated effort to finally get all the others, I only had 3 or so random volumes that I picked up over the years. And growing up, I just had one that I read, and because it was out of sequence, and I was just very confused. So it also very much helps to read all the books in order, because there is a loose chronology, but it's so loose that you don't necessarily have to. And I think if you read a volume of each author, you can tell there's a different sort of tone. So I think the Indy books overall are best read in chronological order, but they are separated by the 3 different authors. So the Rob McGregor books are basically their own thing. The Martin Caden books are their own thing, and they're completely terrible, and I would not recommend those really. And then the Max McCoy books are their own thing, and I think they're the closest in tone to the films. I'm just really happy that Secret of the Sphinx was such a good read that the series could close on a real high note. I can't imagine what the series' reputation would be like if they had ended with the Martin Caden novels, because those are so bad that I think most people would throw in the towel and never look at anything outside of those. But you definitely should if you have not read the Max McCoy books, because they are the most Indy in terms of the spirit of the films, and the most enjoyable, straightforward pulp adventures of the Bantam novels. But I still enjoy the Rob McGregor books, and I've really enjoyed getting to read all of these finally. So if you're a diehard Indy fan or you love pulp adventure, you should, I think, read the Bantam novels at some point. And if you're going to read them, I would recommend reading all 12 in order. But if you're just going to read some, I think the most consistently enjoyable and closest to the film's tone are definitely the Max McCoy books. So as always, I hope you've enjoyed my babblings about the magical world of Indiana Jones and the lesser discussed Indiana Jones in print, in the form of the really fascinating and overall kind of all over the place Bantam novels, and especially the wonderfully fun Max McCoy novels. I hate that these are out of print. Again, I know it's very difficult to find these, so just be patient. I do think it is worth it, and I do think it's a really fascinating experience to sit down and read all 12 in order. But again, some are great, some are really interesting, some are very out there, and the Martin Caden books are horrible, so do keep that in mind. The quality varies, and your mileage with them is going to vary extraordinarily. It very much is a case where different fans have different opinions and different rankings and things. So you're definitely going to find some you really like and some that you really don't like. But I think all of them do have consistent Indy elements that are fascinating, and elements that quite frankly, could be used in an indie film, and a lot of elements that are certainly better than the two modern indie films we've gotten, which I don't think are really anything to write home about. So if you've been looking for an indie experience because you didn't like the modern films, I would certainly suggest looking at the Bantam novels, and of these, especially the Max McCoy books. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstore wherever possible by hopefully being able to find some of the out-of-print Bantam novels and enjoy some reading time with our favorite archaeologist. And as always, keep reading print books, keep cracking the whip, and thank you ever so much for watching.